Hi folks, the show is Pocono Perspectives. Thanks for being with us again. We're so happy to have you. And we have a special guest today, somebody who's going to tell us a lot about the history of the Poconos. And the book is Better in the Poconos. And it's written by Larry Squeri. So we're speaking to Larry just a little bit before we came here. Larry, it's great to have you. Thanks for your time.
I'm pleased to be here.
And I wanted to just, the Poconos is so much and so vast, and there's so much history. So if we want to understand that, where do we start? Where did you start when you wrote this book?
Well, the beginning would be the 18th century, and gets to the concept of the Wild West. What do you think of when we say the Wild West? John Wayne, Clint Eastwood, where? Montana,
All out west,
Colorado?
all out west.
Well, the West is a function of time. In the 18th century, the Wild West was the Poconos.
Wow.
You had Indian wars, settlers, all the stuff that you usually see in the movies but taking place somewhere in Wyoming. And that's where I really start the book, with the 18th century and the Indian wars and all that.
So what struck you about talking about the Indian wars? What struck you first? I know that Pocono is a Native American name, right?
Yes. What struck me is, like everywhere else, the Indians lose out and get driven further west. And by the end of the Revolution, they are gone, and which means settlers can come in. Because prior to then, there were very few people here. But after 1800, you start getting settlers like Pennsylvania Dutch farmers in the West End. But the area is still wild. You had urban hunters and fishermen coming here in the early decades of the 19th century. But you don't have a resort economy yet.
And how did that start? What were the early beginnings of that resort economy?
One word: transportation, transportation, transportation. Yes, people did come here before the railroad because the place was out of the way, and the big attraction was the Gap at Delaware Water Gap. And it did attract artists, painters, but somehow it never got the attention that the Hudson River Valley got. So what really put the Poconos on the map as a vacation area was the railroads. Because you have to understand that before the railroad, transportation was very difficult. For example, it took several days to reach the Poconos from Philadelphia by stagecoach. We're talking several days. And actually, the resort era doesn't begin in Stroudsburg or Monroe County, but in Milford, because of the Erie Railroad, which never stopped in the Poconos. It stopped at Port Jervis.
So Milford being the upper northern part of the Poconos.
Yes. And Port Jervis is in New York State on the other side of the Delaware River. But in the 1840s, the Erie is there connecting New York City to upstate New York. People can get off at the Port Jervis station, get on the stagecoach to Milford. So actually, the resort business really begins in Milford. It doesn't really come to Monroe County until the Lackawanna Railroad. The Delaware, Lackawanna, and Western Railroad was laid out in the late 1850s. Nothing to do with passenger traffic, laid out to connect the coal fields of Scranton and Wilkes-Barre, et cetera, with New York City. Passenger service was secondary, but the railroad did go through Monroe County, and it stopped at Delaware Water Gap and Stroudsburg. And well, then comes the Civil War and everything is on hold. But after the Civil War, vacation is realized that in 4 or 5 hours, they can reach Delaware Water Gap. And Delaware Water Gap is really where the big time resort economy begins. Why? because of the railroad. Transportation, even today, transportation is everything.
So getting out of the cities
Yes.
and making that 4 to 5 hour trip, what was the reason that people wanted to
Many
do it?
reasons. One is, do you realize how much cities used to stink way back then, before you have sewers,
Sanitation.
sanitation, even something we take so much for granted, the bath, the commode and all that, doesn't really come into being till after the Civil War. Garbage collection. Cities really stank. And it was also believed, erroneously, that bad odors could cause disease. Now, we know it's not the odor, it's the cause of the odor. But one of the attractions of going to the country was to escape the stink, the squalor of the city. Also, way back then, the whole family would go to the country. Quite often, Dad would continue to work in the city and come out on weekends, but Mother and the children would spend the entire summer in the country.
Were they more affluent? Was it more middle class?
Oh, we're talking middle class.
So upper middle class because they had
Now, the super rich really didn't come to the Poconos. They went to places like Newport.
the Hamptons, right?
Yes. Today, you notice you don't have those beautiful super luxury mansions here in the Poconos. It wasn't the super rich who came here. It was the middle class, the upper middle class, not the super rich. And they start coming in great numbers after the Civil War. Why Delaware Water Gap? Well, the railroad stopped there, but also it's compact, it's scenic, and also the attractions of the Delaware River. You can go boating, swimming, and fishing. You might say, why not lakes? Well, many of your country lakes way back then were used for ice. See, you don't have ice refrigerators. So they would ice up in the winter, and then farmers, as a sideline, because you can't farm in the winter, would cut up the ice in blocks, put it in storerooms, and then it would be shipped by railroad to the cities. And that was a great side income for farmers, the ice business. And it continued until technology and advances in refrigeration made it unnecessary. But also it means that people would not be using lakes for recreation. Because after all, if you're an urban person, you don't want to think that that ice you're using is where, you know,
Right.
you know what I mean.
So after during the Civil War and right after that time period.
Yeah.
So when did the resorts like Kittatinny or Mount Airy, I guess, all those eras of resorts, how did that start?
The first of the big time resorts is the Kittatinny. Started in 1829, basically catering to two clienteles. One, hunters and fishermen who would come here to do their thing, and also rafters. You might say, who are rafters? Well, farmers would also supplement income by lumbering, cutting trees, and then in the spring they would tie the trees into rafts and raft down the Delaware to Philadelphia, and then disassemble the raft and sell the lumber. And then coming back, you either take the stagecoach or save money by walking. Well, rafters had to stop at night. The Kittatinny, which construction began in 1829, would cater to the rafters in the spring, and during the summer to the hunters and the fishermen. And occasionally you do have families who would come up. Plus you also have farmers' boarding houses. This is also big after the Civil War. You see, farming is not productive in the Poconos. The soil, ever try to have a garden?
It is tougher here, much so.
A lot of farmers realize that farming is not very productive, especially once the railroads start bringing in food from the Midwest. So some have realized that money could be made by taking in city boarders, okay, like the lower middle class, people who may not be able to afford the fancy place like the Kittatinny, but might be looking for a rural vacation.
So the concept of Airbnbs or renting a room in your house isn't a new concept.
No, it's not a new concept. And the way it worked, some farmers would continue to farm and the wife would basically cater to the boarders. You could have 4 or 5, and some of them ended up giving up farming altogether and becoming full-time boarding houses, maybe 10, 15, 20 rooms.
And as we continue through the 1850s and get towards the end of that century, is sanitation in the city, still wanting to get out of the city, a big issue? I remember reading in your book about the Quakers also liking the region, being quiet and unassuming, upper middle class, but not wanting to flaunt their wealth,
yes,
but still liking the region. So all those kind of things were happening too at the same time?
Well, the Quakers really don't come till after 1900. They did come as individuals, but the Quaker resorts, and the 2 big ones were Pocono Manor, which still exists but no longer Quaker, and the second one was Buck Hill, which is closed down.
Right.
You want me to talk about the Quakers? Because they are fascinating.
Yes, please.
Okay.
Please.
The Quakers, they develop a lifestyle in which you have money, but you don't flaunt it. And this is one of the reasons they created their own resorts, because if they went elsewhere, they'd be uncomfortable with the person who must tell you how he makes his money. The Quakers decided to create their own resorts, and between 1900 and 1910 we have Pocono Manor and Buck Hill Falls. You might say, why 2? Well, there were 2 branches of the Quaker religion by this time. Buck Hill is by the Hicksites, and the Orthodox Quakers created Pocono Manor.
And the library still exists in near Buck Hill,
yes,
I think.
They created it.
And there's still some things surviving today related
yes,
to that period, besides Pocono Manor. Now, of course, the Buck Hill Inn is no longer with us, but Pocono Manor obviously is.
Yes.
So just naming those 2 things, if we can jump just a little bit ahead to, now we're in the 1900s a little bit more, so couples resorts.
Yeah.
How did we get to that period too?
For more than a century, the Poconos have been the center of a thriving resort industry, catering to families, married couples, young singles, and honeymoon couples. Here in this beautiful mountain resort area, the Pocono visitor will find magnificent hotels that are like castles in the sky, charming lake resorts, cozy inns, lodges, luxury housekeeping cottages, rustic lakeside cabins, and smart motels with every modern convenience.
After World War II, some shrewd entrepreneurs realized that a lot of people now have money for honeymoons. And the big gimmick of the honeymoon resort was everybody there is having a honeymoon. See, prior to that, honeymooners would go to regular resorts and maybe would stick out. Also, you have to understand that people married young. I mean, your typical bride's 18 or 19, and the groom may have been 20, and they may have felt out of place going to a resort where you had all ages and all that. You go to a honeymoon resort, everyone's your age. And the concept really took off. And by the 50s, the Poconos are known as the place for honeymoons. I think like 2,000 a week. 2,000 honeymooners a week. And really it put the Poconos on the map, because the Poconos always had to compete with the Catskills and with other areas. It was never a major area, but the honeymoon resorts allowed it to really compete with Niagara Falls.
So if you had to point to a family or a corporation or someone who actually brought that idea to life, who would your research point to?
Well, Morris Wilkins, He did not originate the concept, but he came up with the heart-shaped bathtub. Now he takes credit for, maybe it's not him, but tends to be associated with it because I realized more than one person claims to have invented it. But Morris Wilkins, not only the heart-shaped bathtub, and he said after a while that became passé, and so the champagne glass, which is like 2 stories high,
Champagne
and
towers.
is shaped like a champagne, it's really like a whirlpool of sorts.
So as that was created, it declined. And what do you attribute that decline or change to in the next evolution?
The Poconos keep on reinventing themselves. We can begin with skiing. Now, skiing did not come sooner because, as we know, it doesn't snow that much in the Poconos. But by the 1960s, the process of creating artificial snow, as long as the temperature falls below freezing, was perfected. And it was a brilliant masterstroke, and it's a good case of reinvention.
And even in the case of Camelback, where you have a ski resort,
Yeah.
an indoor water park,
Yes.
and a resort, and then of course you have snow tubing.
Yes.
It's just evolved.
Just evolved.
Versus what it had been before. You're a retired professor, correct?
Yes.
What did you teach at ESU?
History.
History. What types of class?
Well, it was mostly world civilization. I did Italian history and Russian history. I started off in European history. So how did I end up doing a history of the
why the
Poconos? Well, to do research in non-American history, you have to go to that country of origin. So here I am at East Stroudsburg University looking for a topic that's local. And I realized no one had done a history of the Poconos with the emphasis on the resorts, which were the dominant industry of the last 150 years. And most of the research I could do without taking a trip. A good deal of the information was in old newspapers on microfilm at the East Stroudsburg Library. I would go between classes.
So it gave you time for research.
So I spent a lot of time in that library just going through old newspapers looking for references to the resorts or whatever. The Monroe County Historical Association has all sorts of odds and ends.
Very good.
Very good.
Very good. Causes you to look in the crystal ball a little bit. What do you think is the next evolution for the Poconos?
First and foremost, people have to get tired of what is now cutting edge, the indoor water park. Kalahari and Great Wolf and all of them are not passé.
So I think we're leaving the future just where it is, right in the future. Happy to have Larry Squeri here. The book is Better in the Poconos. I'm Chris Barrett for Pocono Perspectives. We thank you so much for being here. Look for us in the future.